Hey everyone, my name is Cassie Hamer and this is my new book, The Stranger at the Table, and I'm delighted to be here with Better Reading doing a Q&A. So I went into journalism because I love stories and I love storytelling, but when I was a child and an obsessive reader, it just didn't occur to me that I could be a novelist, because all the ones that I was reading the novelists were either English, or they were dead, or they were just seemed an unattainable thing. So I did the next best thing, which was to go into TV reporting, where I got a chance to meet famous and not so famous people, but to tell their stories. And I was a very sort of curious person, and I love asking questions, not so much answering them. But the beauty of journalism is that it teaches you to distill a story into its most basic elements. And especially with TV, when you've only got about 90 seconds to tell a story, you have to do it in language that's immediately understandable and makes an impact. And I think the thing that has really helped me from journalism with fiction writing is that capacity to understand story structure, so beginning, rising action, climax and finale, which I think does mimic in some ways the way a news story is told, but also a real appreciation for deadlines. So when I was in TV, that 6 o'clock deadline is so finite, and you don't have time to wait for a muse or for inspiration. You have to just get your bottom in the chair and write. And I find that approach with fiction is really helpful. Like, I'm not waiting for creative inspiration. I just sit down, I set myself a word target, and I get down to business. I'd worked in regional TV for about 6 years, and then I came and worked in Sydney TV for about 4 years, and I was initially on the production desk for the overnight shift for like Sunrise and the morning news, and then sort of gradually worked my way up into being an on-the-road reporter for the 6 o'clock news and for some of the other news bulletins. So there's a bit of behind the scenes stuff and a bit of front of camera stuff as well. It's such a different skill set to be able to promote your novel versus writing your novel. Like, they're totally sort of different things, and to talk about your work is so different to actually doing the work. And I think these days it's just expected that you do it, and authors are expected to do it. And I think, you know, the next generation probably won't have a problem because they're just used to looking at their phone cameras all the time. But for old people like me, it can be a bit uncomfortable. I do a bit of both. I do a bit of plotting when I need to, and then other times I find that writing creates writing, and the act of having my fingers on the keys, there's some kind of magic where it itself starts to spawn ideas. So I'm not the kind of writer who can sit down and do a 20,000 word outline and do specific exact chapter breakdowns. Usually I'll start with a premise, like a what if concept. So for this book, it was, you know, what if a stranger came to Christmas Day who wasn't really a stranger, like who was actually someone who knew something about the host that had the potential to really blow up the family. So start with that concept, and then I start to think about, well, who is at that table? Who are the characters? Who has the most to lose? And what sort of character traits can I give them to give the reader the biggest sort of payoff? So I start to think about the characters, and then I'll probably map out some loose ideas about the major sort of turning points in the book. And I think with this one, I wasn't sure that I exactly knew who would die, and I certainly didn't know why or how. And that process developed over the course of the book, and the themes of the book became more apparent to me. So it really is a bit of both. I'll get to a point where I have to stop in the process, in the writing, and think, okay, well, what should happen next? What could happen next? What's going to be the most dramatic thing that I can think of, but also what's a plausible thing to happen. And so it is a little bit like that saying, there's a saying about how, writing is a bit like driving a car at night, that, you can only see as far as the headlights, but if you keep looking forward, you'll get there eventually. And I think that's true. I need to know a little bit in advance what's happening, but I don't need to know the exact whole route of how to get there. Oh, twists are one of those things that often come to you at the most inconvenient time. Like I'll be in the shower, all soaked up, nowhere near a pen, and I'll have a lightning bolt of inspiration, and I think, I can't write it down. And I figure that if it's good enough, that I will remember it. And I often get bolts of inspiration while I'm walking around my local park as well, as far away as possible from a notepad and pen. But I do have the phone if I need to. And I find that actually listening to podcasts and listening just to people's experiences of life and delving into subjects that I'm really interested in, that often spawns ideas as well. Observation is the key to good fiction. I mean, the more that you can be specific about your observation as well, and that's what creates characters who really feel three-dimensional, is when they have particular, not even quirks, because you don't want them to seem eccentric, just we all live in very particular ways, but once you slow down and really start to notice them, I think that's what really creates texture in a character. That is a good question. I think this book in particular is a balance of plot and character. But I think without the two coming together, you don't get the impact. So I know that there are some writers who are really interested in the plot and the red herrings and the twists and the turns. And I appreciate that kind of writing because it's very clever and it requires a lot of planning. But I am also a heart person. I think of plot sometimes as brain and emotion and character as heart. And for me, the sweet spot of fiction is when those two things sort of come together. And one of my touchstone writers is Liane Moriarty. She was really the one who switched me on to this kind of domestic fiction with intrigue. And she really is the master or the queen of bringing together incredible character with emotion, with depth, but also page-turning plot. It's just something that really appeals to me because it's relatable. I recognise the characters on the page. They're people I might meet in my everyday life. But there's all this weird stuff happening to them, which is just so compelling and makes me want to race to the end. When fiction is really humming, what you have is a character where there's almost a sense of destiny or inevitability about the things that are happening to them. So that's the plot. So really, great fiction is that perfect marriage of character and plot coming together. Yeah, well, I'm from a family, obviously. I'm one of 3 kids. I have parents who I love dearly, but that's not to say that there's not tensions in every single family. Show me a perfect family. They just don't exist. So I'll admit that I do write a lot inspired by personal experience. My books aren't autobiographical. They're not about anyone that I know in my real life. But I definitely do draw on some specific incidences and conversations that I've had with family members that I then take and twist enough, hopefully, that they can't recognise themselves or the event in the book. The thing with dialogue, when it really works in fiction, dialogue is quite pared back and you get the sense that it's unfolding very naturally. And when people speak, they usually don't say what they actually mean. And what I really love in fiction is when you have a character saying one thing on the page, but you can also hear their internal monologue saying the exact opposite thing and saying what they really think. And we are all like that. we all have this ongoing inner monologue that we carry around all the time, and it's our most honest self. But if we actually said what we were thinking, people might think we're slightly deranged, or it might lead to so much conflict, because we have to maintain a veneer of manners and politeness. But the beauty of fiction is that you get to peek inside the character's brain and know what they're really thinking. And so dialogue, I strip back quite a bit and cut out a lot of unnecessary information, which I can then sort of insert into that inner monologue and description.
It's very natural to lie.
Yeah, we lie all the time. I don't think I lie about big things, but white lies quite often. And I think, I'm someone who thinks that it's okay to tell a white lie, because most often it's about preserving peace and harmony and being polite. And I think that's okay. But I think what this book shows is that really deep secrets, important lies, significant lies, do eventually worm their way to the surface in a family. Lots of families have secrets that are being kept for decades. But the truth comes out, and in this book it comes out in a really explosive and damaging way. This book does have definitely a darker edge to some of my previous work, and it was a very specific decision to explore, in particular, alcoholism in this book. It's a very common problem. But I think many of us have a very stereotypical notion that an alcoholic is, the older guy that you pass on the street drinking out of the brown paper bag. We know now that that's not true, and that's largely due to the work of some really brave women of my age and stage. People like Shanna Wan, who was nominated for Australian of the Year, who started an organisation called Sober in the Country, and has spoken so openly about her experience of, substance abuse with alcohol. There's another woman, also of my age and stage, Talitha Cummins, a journalist who was an ambassador for Hello Sunday Morning, talking about very similar things. So we now know that alcohol can be an issue for women and men of any age. There are some factors that contribute to developing that, some hereditary factors, for instance, childhood trauma can sometimes play into that. I've had my own journey with alcohol. I was a pretty enthusiastic drinker in my 20s. My 30s, I didn't drink much because I had children and was breastfeeding and constantly pregnant. And then during COVID, I was really looking forward to having my pink gins on a Friday night. But then someone who I knew experienced an emotional crisis, and there was some use of alcohol in ways that were unhealthy, and that frightened me, and the impact that it can have on families, in particular if there are children present. And so I decided to stop drinking about 3 years ago, and I haven't had a drink since then. And it was sort of coinciding with the writing of this book, and it just helped me to take a step back and look at the ways in which our society does use alcohol, use and abuse alcohol. When I was a younger mum, there are a lot of memes around about, mummy needs a wine, it's wine time for mummy, sort of a thing. And at the time, like many people, I thought that was quite funny. But now, a few years on, I think we know better. And perhaps the question to ask is, is it healthy for women to feel that they need to resort to a drug to help them cope with the pressures of modern parenting? And, what is it about being a mum of today that's creating that stress and that pressure? And so all of that, I'm so interested in mothering in particular, and the pressures on modern mums, that I wanted to feed that into the book, and in particular a mum who has alcoholism and is facing the shame and stigma that comes with that condition as well. As with so many mental health conditions, awareness is just growing and growing, and we're understanding more and more about these conditions, and hopefully books like these are stimulating conversations that continue to break down the shame and stigma around people who suffer with these illnesses, because it is an illness. It's not a personality defect, or it's not a lack of discipline. It is a mental health condition and needs to be treated as such, and people who suffer from it, I hope, are met with kindness and compassion rather than judgment. But it's difficult. I mean, the main character in the story, Marianne, who is an alcoholic and a mum of two, she carries a lot of shame and guilt around the condition that she carries, because it did cause a terrible accident that cost 2 lives, and she has to live with that, and living with it is extremely difficult. I'm glad you asked about that, because I've had a lot of feedback that the last, sort of third of the book really gallops towards a finish, an exciting finish. And writing that was one of those experiences where it did feel almost like momentum started to take over, and I could just see it unfolding. This often doesn't happen to me. Often writing for me is a really difficult, doubtful process that's fraught with insecurities and uncertainty. But this book almost took on a life of its own towards the end, and I could just see how to explode things for the characters to make things just worse and worse and worse. Like, that was sort of what I was thinking. Make it worse. How do you make it worse? What could this character do in this moment that's going to make it even more tense and terrible? So that writing the ending to this book was actually a really enjoyable experience, because it did start to feel like I was just translating what was going on in my head through to what was coming out on the page. It's a good question. I think the thing with this book is that, yes, there is darkness, but there are definitely some jokes littered through it as well. I think that is really, it's an exaggerated reflection of real life, but it is real life. I mean, that is the nature of it. We go through terrible times. There's often in the most terrible times, there's some dark gallows humour to be had as well. So I think I can write it because that's how I experience life, really. Not quite to the same degree, but yeah, it has its ups and downs. I think the thing is as well that I don't find it too hard to separate fiction from reality. So between the hours of 9 and 3, I'm writing make-believe and I'm creating a story. But when I step away from that computer, I'm back to looking after 3 kids, a dog and a household, and doing life with my husband. And there's quite a separation between the two. So I suppose I can compartmentalise the difference between my fictional life and my real life. And I think that's one of the things I love about fiction, is that it does take me out of myself and my own problems, and I can give some really serious, unpleasant problems to my characters, but they're not actually mine. It draws on some personal feelings and emotions, but it's not actually me. I actually have really enjoyed going dark. I'm quite leaning into that phase in my life. I'm a bit older, have experienced some more things of life, and fiction definitely for me reflects where my head is at. A lot of this book was written towards that tail end of COVID, and definitely reflected the fact that I wasn't in the most jolly of moods at the time. But now I can see that it is just a growing accumulation of life experiences. You don't get to be 50, which I nearly am, without having experienced some pretty significant ups and downs in life. And I think that readers have a real appetite at the moment for slightly darker fiction, and women in particular, they love the true crime, the dark stuff. And I think that's for a couple of reasons, namely one, that women are prolific readers, and they gravitate towards this genre in particular because I think it's so enjoyable to play amateur sleuth and to work out if you can see the twists and turns before they happen. But more specifically, women do live with this underlying sense of danger. Like, you talk to any woman and we've all held those car keys in our hand as we've walked along a dark street. And I think that's a slightly different experience of life to men. And so we know that there is danger out there. We know that women are more likely to suffer violent crime as victims than men. And what fiction does is it gives us a chance to sort of role play our deepest, darkest fears, but in a very safe way. So we can work out, what would I do if I was in that situation? Because it's more likely to happen to a woman than a man. Of course, it does happen to men, but just statistically speaking, women are at greater danger. And I think those two things together have combined to create this huge interest in darker fiction, and I'm really happy to go there. I thought about this a while ago, and now I'm struggling to think if I can remember. Okay, so for Marianne, who's the main character, I was thinking Phoebe Tonkin, who I'm pretty sure she was in Trent Dalton's Boy Swallows Universe. She played the mum in that, and she's very beautiful, but she's also plays fragility and strength in both measures, and so I think she'd be great. And then for the character of Ellie, who is Marianne's older sister, I was thinking of Sarah Snook from Succession, who's a wonderful Australian actress, and she can sort of play tough, and Eleanor is a lawyer and she's quite no nonsense, so I think she'd be great. And for the mum, who's the other sort of key character, Margaret, I was thinking Heather Mitchell. She's a really well-known Australian actress. You would know her if you saw her, but she's just, she was played the mum in a TV series called Fake, which was based on Stephanie Wood's book about a con man love scam sort of a thing. And Heather Mitchell's just a terrific actress. Thank you so much for listening in and hearing some of my thoughts about writing and about my new book, The Stranger at the Table, which is in all good bookstores. Are there any bad ones? But it's out in all the shops now. Hope you enjoy it and pick it up and let me know what you think.